Greetings. It is Friday, August 14th, 2020. On August 14th and 15th, Pakistan and India celebrate their Independence Days. We wish both of these nations well as we work for peace between Hindus and Muslims in South Asia and among all people around the world. I'm Mahan Mirza, Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to our online conversation series, Engaged, Religion and the Common Good. As we get started, we invite you to join the conversation by visiting our website, ansari.nd.edu, or following us on Twitter at AnsariUND. We are engaged today with Professor Christian Smith, William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. He is a leading theorist in the sociology of religion and author of over a dozen books, including the recent Religion, What It Is, How It Works, and Why It Matters, and Atheist Overreach, What Atheism Can't Deliver. And we are honored to have Professor Smith affiliated with the Ansari Institute as a faculty fellow. Thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to be with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, you know, this is the end of the first week of classes. How do you feel about the reopening of campus? Are you hopeful and as positive as you were in the recent reflections that you shared in the Chronicle of Higher Education?
I am mostly hopeful.
So one of the things you said in your reflections is that COVID-19 mocks the project of modernity. So what did you, tell us what you meant by that?
Well, I follow the now deceased Shmuel Eisenstadt, a professor of sociology at Hebrew University, formerly, who argued that modernity is ultimately not about institutions or factories, etc., but at its heart and soul, modernity is about humanity taking its destiny into its own hands. And so in that case, the sort of the sacred values of modernity, the highest principles of modernity are twofold: freedom and control, autonomy and mastery. Well, if your highest values are freedom and autonomy and control and mastery, COVID kind of totally knocks that out of whack, because it shows how much we're not in control, even with all the science and technology we have, how incredibly thrown off we are, our economy, our whole way of life, by a virus. So in some sense, COVID just takes our highest values as moderns and says, guess again, you're not in control, you don't have so much mastery of reality.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's surprised us all. It's actually even surprised me. You think that we're making such rapid progress, and then suddenly you get something like this where it seems like we have no idea what's going on, and we have no control. But picking up on this, definition of modernity as having like a spirit where we feel like we control our own destiny. And contrasting that to how you've defined religion, which is us turning to our attention to superhuman powers for goods that we are incapable of attaining ourselves. So in this sense, is religion in stark opposition to, in complete contradiction with modernity?
I wouldn't go so far as to say stark opposition and complete contradiction, but I think there definitely is a tension, at least if you buy the understanding of modernity that I'm working with. Modernity is in some sense a rejection of a given religious or theological or cosmological ordering of reality. If those are true, then those are the ultimate determinants of our destiny. If modernity says no, forget a cosmological or theological ordering of reality, there is no such thing, we are in charge of our own destiny, that clearly is in tension with former views. So religious people obviously have figured out many ways to make their religion compatible with modern way of life. So we have modernity, the secularization thesis is not true in very many ways, we've learned. Modernity and religion are not incompatible, but I would say the spirit of modernity, at least Western, especially certain kinds of Enlightenment modernity, are definitely in tension with traditional religious and cosmological views of things.
So if we take this this sort of secularization thesis, the arrow, so to speak, and think about it a little bit more, what has traditionally been the case, so argue the secularists or those who believe in science, that we turn to God or to higher powers in things that we didn't understand before. And the scope of that is increasingly shrinking. So we've been hit by this COVID, but it's just because we haven't really understood it, but we have the capability of understanding it. So instead of filling in there something sacred or superhuman, we just attribute it to our ignorance and in the belief that we can overcome it. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say, first of all, in my view, in my understanding, it's not the case that the more science has learned about the nature of material reality and physical reality, the less the sphere of what we don't understand has grown. It seems to me the more we learn about reality, the more complex and weird the world and the cosmos and the universe become. We just keep drilling down and down to deeper and stranger realities, and things that Newton never could have imagined seem to exist out in the world. And so in some sense, science, the advance of science, which I really believe in, has made reality much more mysterious to us, I think, is the reality of things. But in a more focused way, I do think that the COVID-19 crisis is at its deepest level a kind of an existential problem for moderns. This is part of what I meant when I said before, if we think we can control everything with our science and technology, on the surface, it's a problem of when do we reopen schools and when will we get inoculations and so on. But at its deepest level, I think it shakes the modern world in realizing how incredibly vulnerable we are, how precarious our existence actually is, how close to death many or most or all of us actually walk every single day.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to this idea of death, our frailty, because they titled, I don't know if you gave the title or was it the Chronicle, they said the title was "We Are Frail and Mortal. Life Rarely Offers Happy Choices." And one of the things you mentioned was, and I quote there, "If I fall ill or even die in the course of teaching, it will have been for something I most love and value in life." And to some, this might be kind of language that is evocative of martyrdom. How do you respond to that kind of reading?
Yeah, I certainly don't wish to pose myself as some kind of grand martyr. And a lot of people, I think, misread that as me taking some heroic stand. I simply meant it as a personal statement about where I am in the whole business, not trying to say what anyone else should think or feel or be or do. But I think, but it was an authentic statement on my part. I was sincere. And what I meant by that was simply, we're all going to die one way or another. There are a lot of terrible ways to die. There are a lot of mean, stupid ways to die. There are a lot of tragic ways to die. I would like it if I could die doing something that I really believed in and loved. So I'd rather that not be sooner than later, but I also would rather die of something really meaningful to me than something random or just idiotic or accidental or tragic.
So I'm going to ask a question. I don't know if it's a fair question or even if you can, answer it. But in order to have this kind of relationship to death that I would say is, is a recognition of our mortality and then even a kind of embrace of it. Does one need to believe in something beyond death deep down?
I mean, I would say it might help some people, but not necessarily for everybody. I think what's at stake here is not do you believe you'll survive in some state of existence after you die? I think what's at stake is a sense that there are some things in life that are worthy of big sacrifices. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, if a person hasn't discovered something they're willing to die for, they're not fit to live. Now, I'm obviously no Martin Luther King Jr., and that idea can be applied in lots of ways. But I think it's perfectly plausible that non-religious people, secular people, atheists, could well have many things that they're so important to them, they're willing to make big sacrifices for, and possibly even risk their lives over. We know that this is the case empirically. It's not a conjecture. So it may help if some people think there's a heaven or a reward or life after death or life in a God, but I don't think it's necessary.
So, what I want to ask you now is something about our shared living in this global world. In this piece, you also said that science, and this is, I believe, also your thesis in the Atheist Overreach book, which I very much enjoyed. Science can contribute vital facts to moral decision-making, but it can never settle such decisions. And so the question is, where do we get our moral compass from? And more broadly, how do we develop a moral compass that's shared enough across all the diversity that we have on the planet, that enables us to flourish together rather than destroy each other?
Well, that's a huge question. It requires a big, long, elaborate answer, and I'm not sure I have all the answer. But my view is that people get their moral orientations from big narratives that they embed their lives in, that stories that are not scientifically provable or proven. They may be secular narratives, they may be religious narratives, they may be combinations or other kind of narratives. But in the end, I argue in another book that we're really believing animals more than knowing animals. And so we start off with these fundamentally presupposed narratives, stories, frameworks that the postmodernist notwithstanding, I think we do like to have these sort of coherent narratives that try to make sense of our life. And they tell us what's good, what's right, what's just, what's obliged, what's worthy. And that's where our compasses come from. Moral compasses, not science. Science itself and a belief in it, so to speak, is part of a narrative. It's part of a larger narrative that science itself could never validate or tell you that this is preferable to another one. So that's where I think they come from now. So that leaves us with the problem of pluralism, which you just said, which is how do you live civilly, or at least peacefully, in a world where people are living out of different narratives. And that's our problem, right? I mean, that's the world's difficulty. We are hyper-social creatures. We have the capacity to invent. This is a sociological point of view, the capacity to invent and commit ourselves to all sorts of imagined communities, nation, tribe, religion, etc., ethnicity. And that can set us at odds with each other, tragically. How to go about living together. I think that this is where I gravitate toward Aristotle. I do think that there is a common human nature, despite all of our differences. I do think as animals, we have a particular kind of nature that we all share. And I think that at least provides the basis to begin to think about and talk about what is a good human life, whatever your religion or nationality or beliefs are. What does a good society look like? What are the conditions that are required for humans to flourish? I don't think it's all up for grabs. I don't think it's all linguistically constructed. So I'm not a postmodernist in this sense, even if I emphasize narratives. So I'm a realist, not an optimist. So I don't have a huge amount of hope that this can happen, but I think there's at least a basis for conversations. And I think, what the Ansari Institute is in part an attempt to foster those conversations, which are really important. Then sociologically, the other thing is obviously as simple as for people who are different to get to know each other, not as master and slave, but as equals, and learn about each other. And a lot of the barriers can fall down. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible.
Well, thank you for that. And one would think that higher education would contribute towards maybe helping us uh, live a better shared civil life. But I turned to a piece that you wrote in the Chronicle a couple of years ago, which was titled "Higher Education is Drowning in BS." So that gives me the impression that you don't think higher education is necessarily going to come up with a grand solution. But one of the points that you make in that, and the points were aphoristic, so it's a lovely read. You said BS is, and then you continue and you have a number of statements. One of them was BS is the grossly lopsided political ideology of the faculty of many disciplines, especially in the humanities and social sciences, creating a homogeneity of worldview to which those faculties are themselves oblivious, despite claiming to champion difference, diversity, and tolerance. That's a mouthful, but it's deeply riveting. Say more about this homogeneity, and specifically, since we're talking about the reopening debate, did you find that the reopening debate was fairly homogeneous in these disciplines, and did you feel that you were going against the grain in your views?
On the first point, I mean, it's no secret. We pretty much know this. It's documented quite well that over a long period of time, especially humanities and social sciences, or the professoriate in general, has become more and more uniform, not uniform, but like the center of gravity is very much kind of politically leftist, progressive, however you want to put it, multicultural. I'm not making a judgment about that per se, but I'm saying higher education and the professoriate is less diverse than the world, than the students that come usually, than the populations of states that support state universities. And I'm not unsympathetic to those worldviews, but the fact is that when it gets so concentrated, it can become a problem because you don't have genuine discussion across difference. You have way too much sort of agreement and taken for grantedness, and a failure to recognize that there are many more different views of the world historically and in the world today than is considered in higher education. So as a matter of principle, I'm a pluralist, and I just wish there was more diversity and better arguments instead of everyone kind of coming from the same place. I don't think that's good for education. That mostly has to do with politics, economics, social life. On the question of reopening universities, it's interesting, the division lines have shifted on, to very different kind of terrain and fissures. My own department in sociology is deeply divided about whether Notre Dame should reopen. And it's not at all along political, ideological, economic view grounds. I think it has more to do with age, vulnerability, whether one has young children. I don't want to be reductionistic about that, but different people have different views. They may totally be on the same page ideologically, but when it comes to should we bring students to campus, they have very different points of view. So something about this, the public health nature and the personal vulnerabilities it involves has just changes the parameters of the entire discussion.
Interesting. Yeah, it's so immediate to everybody's own situation.
Yeah, it also, I think, for some people, I think it also highlights the faculty versus administration tension, rather the liberal versus instead of the liberal versus conservative tension. So yeah, it's all very fascinating.
it is. Now, in that BS article, you did, I think there were some points that hit Notre Dame negatively. For example, this one where you say BS is hyper-commercialized college athletics and administrations sucking the teats of big money. But the first point in your list, which I want to highlight here, is BS is the university's loss of capacity to grapple with life's big questions. Because of our crisis of faith in truth, reality, reason, evidence, argument, civility, and our common humanity. So my question is, do you think Notre Dame has been an exception, at least in this regard, in higher education?
First, as a context, when I wrote the BS piece, it wasn't about Notre Dame per se. It was about American higher education as a sector. My own view is that on most of those points, Notre Dame does much better than many universities. Clearly, Notre Dame is not immune from all the forces and dynamics that are, in some ways, I believe, corrupting higher education. But there are things about Notre Dame that I think make it somewhat different, at least. Even on sports, you'll notice, of course, Notre Dame football is a huge deal, but our stadium is not loaded with commercials for, diet soda and, car oil and so on. So at least we've resisted commercialization so far on that front. So I'm actually quite proud of Notre Dame's approach to athletics, even if it does dominate things. I do think that Notre Dame is different than many universities, and I do think that can be attributed to a variety of factors, possibly, the long, deep Catholic history, being in the Midwest, say, and not San Francisco or Manhattan. But I do think part of it is the Catholic heritage and the Catholic commitments, such as they are, of the university. It tends to attract a certain kind of student. It tends to put off a certain kind of student. Same thing with faculty. So clearly we're not a Catholic school in the sense that some are, but I do think it helps to make Notre Dame somewhat immune to some of the most pernicious forces. When it comes to opening the campus, I think that actually the Catholic faith is a significant influence as follows. A lot of faculty tend to think what matters on the university is their classes, what happens academically. But Notre Dame's vision is actually much more robust than that. In fact, in some sense, as important as what happens in classes is what happens in dorms and around campus, in the sense of personal formation of students, especially undergrads. You might even say spiritual formation of students. I'm a faculty resident in a faculty in residence in a dorm, and it's amazing to me how much, because the rector is a Catholic priest, it's amazing to me how much Catholicism comes across, not in a controlling or manipulative way, but it is part of the larger culture that's going on. And so for us to say we're gonna have all our classes online means students may get credit and they may learn something, but that whole formation process, more broadly, that the university is trying to affect with students, would essentially be lost. And I think that that's part of the decision. Whereas not every school has that vision of forming undergrads. They're much more about careers and credits and how building the state's economy and so on.
Yeah, thank you for articulating. That's a very important point. So let's move to conclusion, and let me ask you about your major contribution to the philosophy of social science, which you call critical realism. And you say that it is the meta-theoretical direction in which American sociology needs to move. So we just have a few minutes, and you can take as much time as you like, but give us a kind of like elevator pitch of why critical realism is so important.
So a lot of social scientists don't want to think about the philosophy that's running in the background of the work they do. They just want to say, show me the data, show me the evidence. But the fact is that all social sciences, in fact, everything we do, has some kind of operating philosophical background that tells us what matters, what we should look like, what an explanation is, and so on. Historically, in American sociology, positivism was a dominant force. Positivism has been largely discredited, but it's still a sort of the ghost that haunts the hallways of academia in some ways. Obviously, I can't teach a course here on what positivism is, but I hope your readers get it. The alternative is hermeneutics, which I think is really a good correction, but it doesn't go far enough. At least the way it's often been articulated in the social sciences, maybe by Peter Winch at the extreme. So critical realism basically says we need to hold in tension a whole bunch of truths that different schools have pulled apart. One of them is ontological realism, that there is a reality that has existence aside from our consciousness of it. Reality is not consciousness dependent, human awareness dependent, in a way that a certain post-Kantian sort of understanding of things might tend to lead. The second, however, is to say it's not a scientific realism. We don't have direct access to reality. So the second point that has to be held in tension is epistemic perspectivalism. That is, we all see things, every scientist sees things from a perspective, from a point of view, from a historical trajectory, from a certain cultural framework. So all of our culture, all of our scientific knowledge is mediated to us through perspectives. Which some simple realists don't want to acknowledge. And that means that there's also epistemological fallibilism built into all of this. We always have to acknowledge that we could be wrong, we're not certain, we're groping our way forward. So critical realism wants to affirm reality, and that the goal of science is to get our brains corresponding in some way that seems to work with the way reality really is, and to understand how and why reality works the way it does. And so an emphasis is on causal mechanisms. We're not interested in understanding surface associations between variables. We want to understand the underlying causal mechanisms that recurrently make the world operate the way it does. What's interesting as far as Ansari is concerned is critical realism opens things up to a realm of possibilities. One of its commitments, for example, is that there are many real things that cannot be observed, that there are levels of reality, and the empirical world, the observable world, only represents how some of them operate, but underneath of those are deep causal structures and powers that are not observable. Well, if that's true, that's a rejection of positivism's empiricism and materialism, which has the implications that it's possible that there are dimensions of reality that are real and exist out there that science or simple observation cannot access. Meaning, whereas positivism a priori excluded certain metaphysical and religious commitments, critical realism doesn't. It's either agnostic about them or perfectly open to them as possible accurate descriptions of reality.
Lovely. Well, for those of you who have tuned in, you have just received a program of lifelong study. That was Chris Smith, William R. Keenan Jr., Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's been a pleasure having you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed the conversation.
And thank you to all our listeners. Please follow our Twitter feed at AnsariUND or visit our website ansari.nd.edu to stay in touch.